I have two scriptures I'd like to share with you today, and the first one comes from the Old Testament book of Exodus, beginning in the 16th chapter, and we will be looking at the 10th through the 15th verse. Exodus 16, beginning with the 10th verse. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. This, of course, is the setting in which Israel is now in the wilderness, having been taken and set free from Egypt. But now they're having problems about having to work themselves and try to survive in that rough environment. And so the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. Turning now to the Gospel of Mark, we find in the Gospel of Mark in the 6th chapter that we have the feeding of the 5,000, one of several times that Jesus would feed the multitudes. And it's very clear in Matthew as well as in Mark that the connection that's wanting to be made is to the followers of Jesus on the mountain and in the areas on the plains, being similar to the people of Israel in Moses' day. And that God will provide for them in the same way that God provided for them in the past. But there is a different spin, a different take that I want us to look at this morning. So listen carefully as we hear the reading of the feeding of the 5,000, Mark chapter 6, beginning with the 30th verse. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. And what has happened is they have gone out and have had tremendous evangelistic success. They have brought new people into the kingdom. They have people now that are following Jesus, men, women, children that are just flocking to him, and it has brought about all of the concerns that larger growing crowds can bring. And then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it is already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So in other words, they're kind of defeating what's going on here and saying, send them away, because we can't figure out how to meet their needs. But Jesus answered, and I think this is the key that we often overlook in this text. Jesus answered, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and then give it to them to eat? Holding on a little bit there, aren't they? How many loaves do you have? Jesus said, go and see. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate. There's a gap here. We don't know exactly what happened, but they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men alone, not counting the women and children, who had eaten was 5,000. 5,000 plus were fed that day. And this feeding of the multitudes was the miracle that is very clear was done time after time. 3, 4, 5,000 people. They only counted men in those days. There'd be the women and the children. All of this would have gone on. It's interesting because what I want to have us do today is to look at this familiar account and look at it from a little different angle than we oftentimes do. To look at it from a little different angle in terms of what we oftentimes envision versus probably what really happened. You see, we have a tendency to let the movies that we watch, and goodness knows I love to watch movies, and I'm interested in seeing the new Ben-Hur, The Tale of the Christ that's coming out, and there's other movies that have been out. I like a good movie that makes you think and challenges you, but oftentimes we let the Hollywood version of something affect what we think happened when we read the Bible. And when you see the stories that have been told about Jesus, the story of the Bible, and the greatest story ever told, and many others that have been done, when they reach this part about the feeding of the 5,000, they always have a problem in that they show it with Jesus breaking it real quick and all kinds of food just pouring right out from him. But I want us to look at something a little different today. I want to tell you a story. One of the nice things about being retired and going out to other churches is I get to tell some of my favorite stories again. Because you can't tell them too often at your church because otherwise people, oh, I've heard that one before. But one of my favorite stories is when I was a freshman in junior college, we lived over in Centralia, Illinois, and I was going to Kaskaskia College, and my older brother had a friend that owned a 1950 Willys Jeep. Okay, now that was not a new Jeep, okay? It was a very old Jeep, and we used to go out on all the back oil well roads and stuff around the Centralia area, and we'd go mudding, as we called it, in that Jeep. And my older brother's friend decided he wanted to sell that Jeep. And so I decided I was going to buy it. And I had saved up enough money, and I went to Danny, and I said, let me buy that Jeep from you. And he gave me a nice deal because he wanted to keep it in the family, so to speak. And I still remember the day when I walked in, and I handed him the check for that Jeep, and he handed me the keys. And he said, now, you know how to operate everything, right? Because I can show you. Oh, no. He said, I've been out mudding with you enough. I know how everything works. I know how you shift the gears to get it in full wheel and everything like that. And I was so excited, just give me the keys. So he gave me the keys, and I drove by, and I picked up 3 of my favorite friends, and we all went out mudding somewhere north of Centralia, a little bit north of Sandoval, this direction a little bit. We went out mudding, and the way you mudded is you just got on the road and you went forever. It got worse and worse and worse until you got stuck. And then you'd flip it in 4-wheel drive and you'd get out. Well, on this particular day, we're driving in an area that I've never been in before, but I'm just tooling down the road probably a little faster than I should have been going. And the road has gone from being asphalt to gravel to dirt until suddenly as I'm driving along, suddenly it's just and everything in that Jeep just shakes like crazy. I've crossed one of those cattle gates, and I found myself in a cornfield. This was in spring. It had been freshly plowed. It had been rainy. And we sunk up to the axles. About, maybe 50, 60 yards in, just right into the mud. Back tires are just spinning like crazy. No problem, I said. I know how to get out of this. So I reached down and I shifted into low and I shifted into 4-wheel drive as those Jeeps would do. And I step on the gas and the back wheels are spinning. And the front wheels aren't doing anything. Nothing at all. The guys were looking, and I said, you guys are going to have to get out and push. And they said, but not with your front wheels not working. Get out and push. It's kind of mud that, just suck the shoes right off of your feet. But I own the Jeep. I got to stay inside. I shift the knobs around again, get everything ready to go, and we're pushing. And again, the front wheels aren't rolling. I said, what's wrong? Well, thankfully, Danny had told me the instructor's manual to that thing was still in the Jeep. It was old. It was kind of torn, beat up. But I get it out, and I can't read it because it's dark. So I have to get out now and just sucking my shoes as I run through there and stand in front of the car reading the book in front of the headlight. Turns out, now some of you people probably know this, I should have, Those old 50 Willys Jeeps had what they call hub locks on them. I see some guys going, oh yeah, you knew what the problem was right away, didn't you? I didn't know anything about hub locks. Danny had always changed the hub locks before we left so he could be able to flip them in anytime he wanted to. So we flipped the hub locks in, and now the front wheels are turning. I've got it in low gear. The three guys are pushing, almost lifting it, and finally it breaks free. But I know I've got a problem. You see, the problem is I know the minute I stop, that car, that Jeep is going to go right back into the mud. So I won't stop. Now, thankfully, the top was not on it. And what I do is I drive around in a great big circle, and each time that I drive around trying to keep that Jeep going, I'm going, jump in, jump in. And each time I make a great big circle, one of the guys jumps in the back of the Jeep, and then the next guy jumps in the back of the Jeep. A couple of times they weren't ready to jump. I probably do about 10 to 12 circles around this freshly plowed field, get all three guys back in the Jeep with me, and out we go across the cattle gate, and I drive home, taking about half of the field with me in mud on the bottom of my Jeep. It's a good story. I like to share it. It's a funny story. About 10 years later, I'm asked to preach at a revival at Shattuck over here. Everybody knows where Shattuck is, right? I'm asked to preach at a revival at Shattuck, and I tell that story and I make some sort of application. You see it coming, don't you? At the end of the service, a guy, I'm convinced in my own mind he was at least 350 pounds and 7 foot tall, farmer, comes up after service when I'm shaking hands, puts his hands on each of my shoulders, looks down at me, and he said, "That was my field." And I laughed, "Sure." No, he says, "That was my field." He said it was not a freshly plowed field. It was a freshly planted field. I had the sheriff out there trying to figure out what to do. That's probably the closest I ever came to going to jail. And 10 years later, he smiles at me, and I said, I hope you'll come back tomorrow. I'm preaching on forgiveness. And he does kind of smile at me, and he says, well, he said, I'll tell you what, 10 years ago, I was mad. I had to replow that whole field and do all that. He said, I'm just happy to finally figure out what in the world happened. He said that next day that he came out there and he saw that field, he said, I could not figure out what in the world, and for 10 years I've wondered about that. Now, I share that story with you because I went home that night and I thought it was over. From my perspective, I'd had a near brush with having a problem of being stuck in a field, and I went home and I thought that was it. And that was my memory, that was my vision of the event. But for this farmer, it didn't even start to happen in terms of his experience till the next morning when he discovered somebody had done several hundreds of dollars worth of damage to his field. And it was only 10 years later that he really came to understand what had happened. Well, with the feeding of the 5,000 and the story that I shared with you today, there is that issue that I was talking about. We look at it and we think this is how it happened. And when we think this is how it happened, we see it as Hollywood shows it or how our minds create it. And we see Jesus in some way just breaking bread and slicing up fish like crazy until about 8, 9, 10,000 people, counting women and children, have all been fed. If you think about that, the logistics of that are beyond what is even miraculous. The time frame of that would be absurd. But if we talk about it being anything else, is it less than a miracle? Well, I want to challenge your thinking today because I believe in miracles. I believe God can work in any way He wants. I believe God fed those people in the wilderness in a way that was truly miraculous. But I think Jesus is wanting us to see a different way of seeing how we could be in mission and how God, through Jesus, was calling us to be involved with others. And here's what I want to challenge your thinking about. If you hear that story, Jesus has all these hundreds and hundreds of people coming to Him in a desolate place because He's gone on a retreat, but they have followed Him. They have all come to Him, and the disciples, who are hanging out mostly with themselves, it would seem, don't know how to feed them. But let's look a little bit at the setting, a little bit what was done. Jesus was teaching. Have you ever asked yourself, now, my mom used to always say, I just believe it. And I'd always say, but I want to know how it happened. Have you ever asked yourself, if Jesus is talking to between 5,000 to 10,000 people, including some little children that don't have kittens to keep them occupied, that how in the world was he heard? Even if he went up on the top of a side of a mountain and the people were down below listening, how was he heard? Well, the fact of the matter is, studies show that back in those days, the way you taught, and it clearly uses the word taught, the way you taught was not that you preached to all 10,000 people at once. You had a group, and in Jesus' case, we know clearly it was a group of 12 disciples who had another 10 people with each of those 12, so there was about 120 people. And the way that you would teach is you would be assigned about 100 people that you took care of. And so when it says there was a lot of grass in the place, it meant there was a place where the people could sit down, and they sat down in their groups of about 100, and one of the disciples would come and talk to, and the other 120, the 10 that worked with them, they would come to Jesus, and that 120 would be taught by Jesus. And then those 120 would go to each one of the groups of about 100, and they would repeat what Jesus had said. That's how come they're able to quote Jesus. That's how come they're able to tell the story of Jesus and the parables. They were learning them to share them with others. What better way is there to learn? And so Jesus is teaching these 120, and these 120 now go to their groups. They're there the rest of the day. It's getting late. They're concerned about their group of 100. Men and women and children have started to say, we don't have any food. What are we going to do? And so these 120 and then the 12 that represent the 120 go to Jesus and say, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, notice he didn't say, wait for the manna to fall from heaven or the quails to come in. He said, what did he say? He said, you do it. Whoa. You see, I believe those are the words Jesus is saying to us today. You do it. I said, what are we going to do? And he said, well, what have you got? Count your resources. First of all, see what you have. What do you have? And so these 12, and I'm convinced it was just the 12 they got together. They're 12 men. They've probably been snacking a little bit and everything. They say, well, we got a little bit of bread and we got a couple of fish. That's not going to feed everybody. And then Jesus said, let's see what happens. And he takes the bread and he takes the fish and he breaks it up into 12 baskets with just a little tiny bit of food sitting in the bottom of each basket. And then he says, now what I want you to do is say, this is all that you've got between the 12 of you. But I want you to go out and offer it to those groups that you're a part of. The 10 that are the leaders, and then have your leaders go to the other groups. Now, at this point, I want to say something, and it may be sexist, but it's true. If there had only been 5,000 men in that group, I think they would have been very hungry. Because men, we don't pack for a picnic very well, really, when we go, do we? A few steaks and a grill, and we're happy campers. But I can remember, and it's when we lived right here in Trenton, when Nancy and I, with 3 little girls, one still in diapers, went on our first camping trip up to Nauvoo. And it was hot in August. Remember that? And we were in a Plymouth Horizon. Why I ever bought a Plymouth Horizon, I don't know, but that's what we were in. And we went camping, and I was ready to go with a tent and a couple of sandwiches. Nancy packs the kitchen sink. I mean, we've got diapers, we've got change of clothes, we've got enough food to last us not 3 days, but 3 weeks. We've got a carrier on top of the car, we've got the luggage pulled in the back, and she has taken everything imaginable and turned out about everything that we needed for the 3 days of camping. Because generally speaking, women do a better job of preparing for a trip, a retreat, a vacation, a picnic than men do, right? There were women with children in this group. There's no doubt in my mind that those women brought food for their children. And so the miracle we have is not the multiplying by some sort of magical trick a few things into many, many things, but generosity. Generosity of giving from the heart. That as the crowds gathered in their hundreds saw these disciples and their followers coming to the group saying, all I've got is this little piece of food and this little bit of bread and fish, I think it was probably mostly the women who said, well, I brought some things that I was holding back for my family, but I'm willing to share them with this bigger group of 100 that I've come to know and learn about and pray with. And another group said, I've got some that I've been holding back just for my family. I didn't realize the rest of you didn't have anything. And others began to pull out of their packs and their backpacks and whatever they were carrying with them, food that they had brought, thinking, maybe I needed it for 2 or 3 days, but I'm going to give what I have to the good of the group that I'm with. And so you had these groups that were giving their food, and what it turned out was that the resources were so great that not only was everyone fed what they needed at that meal, but instead of 12 baskets with a little tiny bit at the bottom, the disciples brought back 12 baskets filled with food. There's a point to the story. The point to the story is that Jesus says to us today the same thing that he said to his followers then. When it comes to meeting the needs of the people, you do it. For I have given you the resources to do it. I have given you the gifts and the graces to do it. I have given you the facilities and the abilities to do it. You do it. Now, as I've gone out and talked about twigs and figs, that has been the theme of the message that I bring. Okay, I brought my twig shirt right here. Because I want to tell you something about this church. I was only here for 3 out of 40 years of ministry. And yet, do you realize that this church in that 3 years has affected my retirement, when I took it and when I'm doing it, more than any church I've served? It's your fault that I'm here today. Because when I was here, we did 3 missions trips. Virginia, you went on one of those, didn't you? Did you not go on any of those? Okay. Some of you may have gone. A lot of people went. But one person that went was Lisa Jones, now Lisa Williams. Lisa became a good friend. She went on those mission trips down to southern Illinois, down to Cairo. We camped at Horseshoe Lake, the only place I've ever lived where they shoot mosquitoes for sport, because they'll carry you off if you don't. And we went down there and we worked, and there was planted in Lisa a seed for missions, for ministering to children. A seed that was watered by other pastors and by many of you over the years, until finally, about 12 years ago, she went into the ministry, although she had been involved in ministry in this church for many years before that. Lisa went to Granite City Trinity. She was here a few weeks ago. I'm sure she told most of her story. But what was involved, that involved myself and Nancy, is we had stayed in touch with Lisa. We had remained friends with Lisa through the years. We knew what she was doing in Granite City. And 6 years ago, I started bringing my people from Jerseyville, where I served the last 11 years, down to Granite City to help out with the Twigs and the Figs program and become involved in the ministry of what she was doing. I got so caught up in what she was doing and so excited about doing that kind of ministry right there in the heart of a community that was right in great need as much of the Metro East area, that one thing led to another. Nancy, myself, and Lisa went on a trip to Washington, D.C. to help her share, to be there to help her share and do some things and learn some things about improving that ministry. And while we were there, it was laid on our heart that we needed to be helping Lisa. And so about 2 years ago, we started the plan, and last January, I'm not yet 65, I announced that I was going to retire. I'd been in ministry in the local church for 40 years. I was feeling led to do something else, and it was Twigs and Figs. And so I now am retired, working according to my contract, part-time. In the summer, it's not that way, but I loved it. Every day, 5 days a week, you get up, you go to Granite City, you load up the back of your car with a sack lunch. You go to a location. This is the beauty of Lisa's dream. You go to the communities and the locations where the kids are hungry so they can walk and get their sandwiches and get their drinks and get their lunches. And then you hand out lunches anywhere from 80 to 100 to 120 at each location. This year, we haven't got the final numbers in, but this year in the Granite City area that goes all the way from Hartford down to Columbia, Wood River, Granite City, and many other locations there, they will hand it out over 70,000 lunches. And Nancy and I have gotten to stay mostly in one of two locations and get to know the kids and the parents and the caregivers that come with them. Many of them, that's the lunch that they would get because they're able to walk with the person walking with them, just an older brother or sister. We've been involved in other things, the mobile market and handing out food. And it really has just, for me, become a second ministry, a joy to be involved in and to be a part of. Now, I'm going to say something to this church, okay? I came here that at this point in my message, and I'm almost at the end, I came here and at this point I was going to get all of you to get out your calendars and get out your whatever you carry, cell phones with your calendar on or whatever, and I was going to have you mark the week after Easter to call me up about how you could get involved with the Twigs and Figs ministry in Granite City. Okay? And I was going to have you do that, and I was going to give you my phone number, and I was going to say, call me and we'll get you involved in Granite, because we need people to go out to the street corners and to do this. Okay? But Jan, is my right, Jan? Jen? You have caused me to change my sermon at the latest possible date that I have ever changed a sermon. 40 years, I have never, as I've walked up, said the ending to my sermon won't work. And it's your fault. But it's not just her fault. It's the fault of this church. Wow, on the announcements alone, if I lived closer, I'd come here to go to church. Because I heard announcements today, and as we walked around, I saw some things. And it starts with the puppet ministry. That's an outreach ministry of service. I loved watching you guys last Saturday at the big picnic that we had, in which we gave out over 650 backpacks to children with school supplies in them. I loved watching the puppet show, even though I had a guilt trip, because the puppet show, they ended up putting outside all that black material out in that sun beating down on them, and all these kids were behind there, and all these adults were behind there, and you were sweating, and I was down there getting ready to go back to the air-conditioned church where we were handing out backpacks. Hey, I've learned a few things in 40 years, but they were doing a great job of entertaining the kids. That's a ministry. You do lunches. You do the sack lunches. You do the ministry with 4 other churches in town. I'm not here to tell you, well, I'm here to say if you still want to come, give me a call, okay? We'd glad to have you come over one day a week for 12 weeks and help us out on a street corner handing out lunches, and I think you would enjoy doing it. But what I really want to end up is to say, continue to be the church that you are, and continue to let God grow you even more. Because service to others in the name of Jesus Christ is the response to the call of Jesus Christ himself. When people came to him and said, we see a need. We see children who are hungry. We see people who are hurting. We see people who have all kinds of needs and hurts for clothing and for situations in their life. And Jesus says, I'm glad you see the need. Now hear what I tell you to do. You take care of it. You do it. For we are truly, as you've heard many times, the hands and the feet and the voice of God, saying, I love you in a very real and physical way. And you are a church that is doing it. Given the size of your church, you've had a vision these last several years. You have a building that has potential beyond belief for what you created. You have people, and I look out here, and I would say on the average, you're the youngest congregation that I've spoken to in the last year. So you have the physical ability to do some things. You have the long-term faithful. I like that word now that I'm in my 60s. The long-term faithful who have the ability also to know what to do and how to become involved. And you said something about give. I don't want to ask you to give till it hurts. You know, that's really the best way to give. Not great pain and suffering, but sacrificially. Saying, what do I really need versus what does this world really need? And how in this particular corner of the world can I become involved? I'm here to tell you, you are a good church. You're doing a great job in many ways. But don't rest on your laurels. That's a compliment. But I give it to you with a challenge. Continue not only to do what you are doing, but continue to hear the words of Jesus Christ that challenge you to do more when he says, when you see the need, that need needs to be met. And you do it. Congratulations on what you're doing. Now just keep it up and do more. Man, those pastors are never satisfied, are they? That's what God's calling you to do. And I'll tell you what, that's the way that you not only are a blessing to others, but you are blessed. I have enjoyed all 40 years of my ministry, but in some ways this last year has been the most exciting. I'm hoping that the next year for this church and for each one of you can be the same thing. Let's bow for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, I just ask that you would help us to hear the words of Jesus as a challenge for how we work in the world today. When we see the needs, and each of us will see it differently, each of us will respond differently, but let us hear the words of the call of Jesus when he says, there is a need, now you take care of it. I will give you the resources, I will give you a blessing, I will give you the people that you need, I will give you guidance, and I will give you the power of my Spirit at work in your life. But ultimately, you need to be the one who does it. So, Lord, I pray today that you would challenge each one who is here in the work that they're already involved in. Let them understand how important it is and bless them for it. And for those that are still looking, help them to find a way that they can plug in, give them new insights, new ideas, or ways to connect with those things that are already going on. And Lord, I just pray that 30 years from now, Trenton United Methodist Church will look back and be amazed at how far they have come in responding to the call of Jesus Christ when he said, you go and you do it. Amen.